Hey, it's Matt from Custom Car Grills with a mesh install for the Infiniti Q50. In this video, I'll show you how to cut out the center of your grill, refinish the edges, and install our mesh piece with the end result of what I'm showing here. It all starts with taking off the stock grill from your car. For this build, the grill was from a 2014 through 17 year model with no camera or sensors. I'll be taking the center of the grill out by cutting along the perimeter at a very specific depth. Before doing the cutting, the chrome outer frame should be separated from the black inner part. To do this, lay the grill face down and then get a Phillips head screwdriver. I suppose I'm using a drill with a Phillips bit on it, but you get the point. Remove all the screws from the perimeter and set them aside for reinstallation later. There's a handful of little plastic retainers that are holding it all together. A flathead screwdriver or a small pry tool can be useful for getting into the access point and freeing the clips loose. It might also take a little brute force as well, along with a couple of different angles of approach to fully separate these two pieces entirely. Here's the inner part that I'm primarily going to be working on. And if you either want to keep or sell the stock emblem, then this will be a good time to remove it. It's just held on by two Phillips head screws along with a couple push clips. Just remove the screws and then push the clips to free the emblem loose. Okay, now I have the inner grill part all to myself and I'm ready to do some cutting. I like using an open-ended saw blade like this one to get the job done. Starting on the lower edge, I'm trying to cut through the center of the last diamond openings. These cuts will be refined down later, so the cut doesn't need to be really tight on the edge. I'll repeat this step for the top edge as well. The left and right sides are very straightforward. A clean cut about a 1/4 inch away from the edge should do just fine. No need to really get much closer than that because we'll be doing some extensive sanding and a little bit more cutting soon. With all the proper cuts made, the center section can be lifted out and thrown away. To trim back some of these remnants, I'll grab my Dremel and equip it with their number 543 cutting and shaping wheel. This tool and bit is great for trimming back the plastic a little bit closer to the edge. We don't need to cut the plastic right up to the edge, and you'll soon see why this is being done and why it doesn't need to be super flush. The sides are a little easier to get an angle on than the top and bottom areas, but I still want to be somewhat careful near those corners. Again, I'm just trimming these back close to flush, but not going all the way in. While the Dremel works well, if you have a grinder like this one available, then you can speed up some of this process. I equipped my grinder with a 36 grit disc, and that is chewing through the plastic super quick. It's important to have really good control if using this method. 36 grit is very aggressive, and any slip up could dig into the area that you don't want it to touch. The next step is hard to get on camera, but essentially there's a little overhang from some of the diamonds. And I went ahead and trimmed off this overhang while keeping my distance from the edge underneath of it. If you're not comfortable with making this cut all in one motion, then just do a few light passes over the area to get it done. Now it's time to cut the depth of the grill, and to do so I'll grab some low adhesion masking tape. I'm using a 1/2 inch wide tape that'll contour around the grill fairly easily. This tape should be placed directly in front of the remnants of the old grill diamonds that are on the edges. The end goal is to have a smooth line to cut along with the Dremel and have it look nice with a fixed depth that looks natural. Here's how mine looks after I have the tape in place. The corners required a few small pieces of tape to get just the right contour. That's especially needed in the upper left and right edges where there's a bit of a funky curve going on. The main links of the top and bottom edges are much easier to deal with. And now on to the cutting. I'll grab my Dremel and cutoff wheel again and start cutting from behind the tape line as shown here. This should be relatively easy to follow along, and when I'm done we should have a nice clean cut. The reason we previously sanded down some of the excess old mesh is so that the Dremel spindle will clear low enough for the cutting wheel to go all the way through like this. Keeping a steady hand here will be key, but if the cut gets a little wiggly, don't worry because it can be sanded smooth later. The left and right sides are surprisingly easy to manage given the weird shape. And the tape line is really helping out quite a bit because it's really easy to trace along. The lower corners I felt were pretty easy to transition, but the top ones are a little tricky. Some alternate angles may be needed to get the cutting wheel in position to get those upper corners cut just right. I don't like making cuts like this, and sometimes it can be better to shave down the area as opposed to cutting through it. Well, with all the cuts made, the area that we don't want to keep can be pulled off and thrown away. Some burnt on plastic bits are normal to see on the edge, and those can usually be picked off by hand. Any of the stubborn ones will be sanded off later, so don't go out of your way to get all of them right now. The tape line used for cutting can now be removed and thrown away. And next up, I'll smooth out any unevenness with the initial cut. To do this, the grill is flipped face down, and I'll grab my Dremel again. The top of the wheel of the 543 attachment bit is highly abrasive and works great for slowly shaving down an edge like this. No need to remove much material, this is just smoothing things out. And now on to some painting. I want to swap this chrome frame to black, and to do so, I'll need to at a minimum scuff up the surface. Red Scotch-Brite pads can do a decent job, but a dual action sander works better if you have one available. I'll make a few passes with the Scotch-Brite here and later hit it up with some primer and then do a 2-stage gloss black paint job. Next up, let's do some DA sanding on the inside edge of the grill that we just cut. I'm doing this to rough up the edge for paintwork. To give the grill a little contrast, I'll use a flat black on this inside edge. Having it all one single color can sometimes work, but I prefer breaking these types of projects up with a subtle difference between the inside and outside parts. Here's how my sanded part looks now. It's pretty smooth with all the sanding that was done, and the cut line looks super clean. I'm pretty excited to see how all of this turns out. To primer this up, I'll grab some Spray Max 1K Self-Etch Primer Filler. This goes on really smooth and dries fast, and afterward I'll grab some Spray Max 1K Trim Paint in matte black. Again, this one goes on super smooth, and I love how this doesn't have any runs or imperfections. It's just a really good solid paint from a rattle can. Let's snap on the gloss black outer frame and see how this looks. And I'm impressed. The contrast between these two blacks is great. While this is snapped together, let's flip it around. Remember those screws that were removed earlier? Well, let's get those back in place to firmly hold the grill together. With the frame all taken care of, let me set that off to the side for a moment so that we can take a look at the mesh piece that we have available for sale on our website. This is made from our Perf diamond mesh and finished in a durable flat black powder coat. All the right cuts and contours have been made to make a perfect fit on the grill frame after it's been gutted as seen in this video. The bent tabs of the mesh face forward on the grill, and the mesh installs from behind the opening by dropping it into place like so. Next up, I'll grab some cable ties and foam to temporarily attach the mesh and frame together. The foam helps protect the finish of the grill frame, while the ties hold the mesh tight up against the back edge. This step is pretty easy, but it's also an important one to get right. I like to loop the tail end of the tie through the mesh from the front and have the head of the tie resting on the back of the mesh, like so. From what I've found, this gives the best hold. Also, I like to loop these through a hole near the edge to avoid distortion of the grill frame. And another thing that can cause distortion is over-tightening the ties. Obviously you don't want these to be loose, but it's best to not over-tighten them too. These side areas are pretty straightforward, but the spot near the upper corners may need a little bit of adjustment if the cut of the grill or curve of the mesh is a little off. The top edge is pretty easy too. The only tip I can share is that I like to get the ties near some areas where the adhesive is not going to be applied. With all the ties in place, let's flip this around and double check our work from the front. I want to make sure there's no obvious gaps and that the mesh is lined up straight. This one looks good. So let's go ahead and set it face down again. I'll cut the ties off and throw them away so that they don't get in the way of the next step. To bond the mesh and frame together, I'm going to use some 2-part epoxy. There's a bunch of them out there, but I like to use one called Plyo Grip Plastic Repair No. 3. Essentially, you want to use one that isn't going to be runny and cures in a reasonable time frame. I'm getting this in and around the mesh and making sure to get good contact to the grill frame, while being mindful not to spill any through the front. To even out the coverage, I'm using a small brush. This can help fill in gaps that I might have missed and spread the material out evenly. One thing to note about this build is that no accommodations have been made for cameras or sensors if those are equipped, and additional modifications will be needed for those to work on this grill if you have them. Okay, I've got this all bonded up. I just need to wait about 30 minutes for it to cure. Afterward, I'll come back and cut off the ties and throw them away along with the foam protectors. The grill install is now complete. Let's flip it around and see how it turned out. Wow, check this out. The mesh and grill look seamless, and the contrast between gloss and flat black is really nice. I really dig this badgeless look, though of course, custom emblems or lettering can be added if desired. Here's a render of how this grill will look installed on the car. And overall, this is a fun weekend project that can be done on a modest budget with some simple tools. Anyone who's looking to change up their front end should really give this mod a shot. Well, that's all I have for this video. I hope you liked it, and if you have any questions, just let me know. And thanks for watching.